zu sein. Ich spreche ein bisschen Deutsch, verstehe mehr. So nach der Vorlesung, wenn Sie Fragen haben und Sie lieber die Fragen auf Deutsch anstellen, das ist okay. I say also in English that I'm extraordinarily honored to be here at the invitation of the Institute. Special thanks to Stefan Fielding, who has made all the arrangements and has been a spectacular overseer and guide in my stay here in Hanover, which is coming to an end in a day or so. And I see some of the students who are enrolled or registered in that block seminar. And I shall say here in public and to you all how much of a pleasure that has been to interact with the students who seem to be quite engaged and interested in a topic that ostensibly deals with early Christianity, but really deals with questions of historiography when it comes to the history of religions. Christianity is hence merely an example for which one could easily find other examples. Okay, to my lecture. The question may sound silly. When and why did the Gospel of Mark become a Christian text? One might even say, as we would say in America or Canada, it's a stupid question, since the answer to it is, of course, self-evident. Well, I'll leave it to you to judge whether the question is stupid and whether my answer to the question is also suspect. My talk will have two parts. The largest part is devoted to talking about the Gospel of Mark from its original composition in the first century to its inclusion in the Christian canon. And it is by no means, if one looks at the historical evidence, that it was self-evident or understood that the Gospel of Mark should have been in the canon. And I want to know why it was included, even though there are, historically speaking, some good reasons of why it should not have been. I begin with a little story. The story is told by Marshall Sahlins, the renowned American anthropologist at the University of Chicago, who found the story in an archive of colonial stuff in Hawaii. This is the story. Early in 1841, the irascible British consul of Honolulu, Richard Charlton, fired off one of his habitual letters of complaint to the governor of Oahu. "Sir," he wrote, "I have the honor to inform you that some person or persons are building a wall near the end of a bowling alley belonging to Mrs. Mary Dowsett, thereby injuring her property and violating the treaty between Great Britain and the Sandwich Islands." That's Marshall Sahlins' little story. Now, his interest in this story is how small issues are turned into big events. Or in his somewhat more technical lingo, the structural cum symbolic amplification of minor differences into large-scale animosities. In this case, how a minor difference is amplified into large conflicts. He provides me with an instructive meditation on the historical dynamics by which relatively trivial disputes over very local matters get articulated with greater political, ideological, and political differences on a grand scale. How is it that a very local and specific problem, Mrs. Dowsett wants to prevent some guy from building a wall on her property? How is it that this very ordinary problem gets implicated in conflicts of world historical significance. Mr. Charlton's desire to avoid a showdown on the treaty governing the relations between Great Britain and the Sandwich Islands. I will return to the story at the end of my talk and remark on its analogical value for understanding what happened to the Gospel of Mark in the 2nd century, about 100 years after the Gospel was written. Now to Mark. Despite enormous labors over more than a century on pinpointing the geographical and social setting for the originary composition of the Gospel of Mark, what the American scholar John Donahue concluded 12 years ago is still the case. Quote, "There is no consensus on the setting of Mark, nor is there a method agreed upon for describing the social makeup of a Markan community on the basis of the text." Unquote. Now, consensus is not lacking, of course, because scholars do not like consensus, although they often don't. After all, controversy and argument and lack of consensus is what drives scholarship forward. Nor is the problem fundamentally due to a disagreement on a method for describing a social entity on the basis of a text, though such disagreements are serious in our field. No, the failure that Donahue so correctly notes is a failure because Mark's Gospel actually requires the failure. That is, Mark's Gospel is programmed to thwart the attempt by scholars to find its originary address. Why? Well, as to geographical location, Mark gives us no indisputable address. Even worse, there is nothing in Mark that prohibits us from plausibly locating its point of originary composition here as opposed to there, or there as opposed to almost anywhere in the Roman Empire. As to a community that might have produced and used Mark in its own community formation in the 1st century, the text is no more forthcoming. No matter how much we squeeze the text, we cannot extract from it enough specific information about a group of specific historic agents, including the microsociology of their interaction and the specifics of the group's interests vis-a-vis real-world problems, terms in which Marshall Sahlins would define a community. Any effort, thus, to get at what Mark was up to as a 1st century enunciation with reference to a precise locale and a describable community is something like trying to squeeze milk from a he-goat, so to quip with Diogenes the Cynic. This does not mean that we can say nothing about what originary 1st century Mark, whatever its precise textual form, was up to. If you've read the Gospel, you surely have noticed the heat of its adversarial rhetoric, the almost desperate tone of Mark's justification of the truth of his story, the massive and agitated preoccupation with the destruction of Jerusalem and the Temple, for instance. All of this suggests that at least in the mind of the author, Mark, we must reckon that there was a set of issues that presented worries of a crisis proportion for him. Interests and worries that I have no trouble as seeing very specific and very local, but that do not obligate me to locate the local in a precise place. An assist comes from a recent article by my Canadian colleague William Arnell, in which he argues that Mark is a narrative reflection on exile and identity, possibly by a real-world historical author who is deeply troubled about what Arnell describes as a double exile. Once, that is exiled once, by cause of somehow a tainted Jewish identity. Perhaps someone who's in the diaspora is no longer able to speak Hebrew, returns to the land but finds that the homeland does not welcome him. So he is a kind of a tainted outsider, a stranger in the Judean homeland. Exiled, secondly, from a destroyed, templeless homeland from which he is now finally displaced and forced to make a home and identity in a strange land where homeland and temple do not, even cannot, function even as a nostalgic treasure, because they were never granted to the author as fully his own treasures in the first place. The occasion for thought that results in Mark's story, Arnell argues, is the Jewish war and the fallout subsequent to the war. The gospel is Mark's answer in narrative form to the questions raised by the war, with its attendant dislocations, exiles, and opportunities for reimagining Jewish or Judean identity, nation, and location. Mark's massive emphasis on the war, the destruction of the temple, and the peculiar movements made by Jesus between Gentile, semi-Jewish, and Jewish regions, and between Galilee and Judea, all point to the possibility that Mark is engaging in a post-traumatic reimagining of identity in his Jesus narrative. Now, Arnell is able to make sense of Mark this way without needing a precise originary location nor a community, much less one we should think of as quote-unquote Christian. That is, there's no reason to think that the originary occasion for the gospel is Christian, and this claim, I know, is at this point should be controversial. It will become clearer later on in my paper. Okay, so that is a snapshot of original Mark and his enunciation. We could argue about that. It requires much more detail, but that is all the time I will take. I move on to a second set of remarks as part of the setup for the central point of my argument to come. First, I would like to suggest that New Testament Mark, that is the gospel that we read in the New Testament, I will refer to it as New Testament Mark, is in a complex way that is only opaquely visible, a Christian document of consequence only from the 2nd century onward, when it was pressed into what would now be rather explicitly Christian duties, though largely of a political sort. What I will ask you to consider is that the 2nd century use of Mark either ignored or dismissed the authorial agenda of whoever created the Markan narrative in the first place, as an exercise in thought on matters of exile, identity, and belonging. Second, is also part of the setup, Mark's gospel had a literary history, a fact well enough known and not disputed, even if the precise stages of that history and the New Testament version of Mark's placement in this history, they're not clear and agreed on. And it doesn't really matter for my purpose. What matters is the fact of Mark's literary history. What matters even more to me is that this history cannot be understood on the model of a text that is changing, say, by means of friendly emendations or amendments at the hands of a single school or a community over time, adapting or altering its own precious story of the beginning of the gospel, to quote Mark's first words, to suit changing sociological realities within the group and changing self-perceptions of the group as it interacts with its larger social environment over time. That is, the literary history of Mark appears to be very different from the composition history and literary history of, for example, the hypothetical sayings Gospel Q, or the Gospel of Thomas, or the Johannine literary corpus. Rather than seeing the literary history of Mark as an organic unfolding of a trajectory, possibly in coordination with the social history of a particular Christian group, I would much rather present the history of the literary history of Mark as a history of confiscation. And when I say confiscation, I mean it in the Nietzschean sense of in beschlagnehmen, grasping or claiming an item from the historical or cultural repertoire and redirecting its meaning or purpose, thereby erasing the item's originary meaning or purpose. That is my long gloss on what Nietzsche means by in beschlagnehmen. I'm not sure if that's correct or not. Now, I mentioned two well-known examples in support of this claim. According to those of you who've done an introductory New Testament course, will know about the two-source hypothesis. And according to that hypothesis, Matthew and Luke usurped or stole Mark's general literary structure, as well as most of the discrete parts of the narrative, thus paying respect to Mark's genius as a literary inventor, but erasing or refracting Mark's argument about the importance of Jesus for Mark's agenda. In short, Matthew and Luke confiscated Mark's literary form and structure and erased its content by overwriting it. Second point of evidence I present is that the critically reconstructed Editio Princeps of the original ending of Mark's Gospel at 16:8 is, of course, not how New Testament Mark really ends. Mark continues in chapter 16, 9-20, after what the text critics say was its original ending. The longer ending is a 2nd century addition by an unknown author who made use of the 4 New Testament Gospels in order to make his addition to Mark resemble documents that had attained at least some level of popularity in certain Christian communities. A case can also be made that the beginning of New Testament Mark has been tampered with. It certainly was prefaced later by means of the anti-Marcionite prologue, and if so, both ending and beginning, that is the two most crucial reading bias storage location for any text. Right? I mean, if you want to know what the text is about, you read the preface and you read the conclusion, and that will usually give you a good sense of what's in the middle, what the argument is. So these are the reading bias storage locations of any text. The two most crucial reading bias storage sites in any literary work show the work of secondary scribal or authorial activity. And so I dare to try out the thought that New Testament Mark is a 2nd century exaptation or a confiscation by redaction of a 1st century Gospel of Mark, perhaps read by some 2nd century Christians groups in Alexandria. Now, I use the word exaptation. Is that a familiar term? No. It is a term that was used by Stephen Jay Gould, the biology evolutionary theorist, the late Stephen Jay Gould at Harvard University. He used it in neo-Darwinian evolutionary theory, where it refers to a change of function of a trait in a species during evolution. For example, feathers on a bird. I should have warned you, birds were going to come up in this talk. I'm a bird watcher by hobby, not by profession. Feathers on birds evolved for temperature regulation. So that would be an evolutionary adaptation. But then these feathers were co-opted for flight, and that is an exaptation. The secondary use of a trait of a species. Now, Stanley Stour, a colleague in North America at Brown University, uses this term to refer to the social equivalent, and he means that a social exaptation would be a cultural artifact that in some sense originated in one social formation or environment, but then came to serve a very different use and function in another population or social environment. So that is the exaptation, and I'm suggesting that the Gospel of Mark does not follow a linear trajectory, but that it was confiscated and exapted for purposes other than for what it was written. Mark, I suggest, appears to have been commandeered, a wandering and variable cultural operator, not only in the temporal sense of moving from the first century to the second and back again, but also geographically and, most importantly, as a kind of hapless child in Christian, intra-Christian custody battles. For instance, it is not difficult or too difficult to imagine, because the evidence allows it, that Mark's exaltation, his happiness about knowing the secret of the kingdom of God, the mysterion, it's not too difficult to imagine that precisely this could be exploited by some early Christian mystery groups to serve its own research and or ritual interests. It is just as easy to imagine that some other 2nd and 3rd century Christian intellectuals saw the chief value in Mark's gospel in its passion story in support of an emerging theology of the cross and Jesus' death as a ransom for many, as Mark has it. We know that a crucial battle line formed over the differences between the views of Jesus as a philosopher of esoteric wisdom, a kind of a mystagogue, and Jesus as a suffering savior in the 2nd to the 4th centuries. And I'm suggesting that Mark was one text over which possession rights were fought in this larger battle, a battle in which both sides had long forgotten or chosen to ignore whatever agenda were so urgent for the first author of Mark. Okay, this is the setup. Let me now move to my main point by reconsidering the two best attested data items about Mark in the 2nd century. Both are actually, for scholars in the field, rather well known and often remarked, but together they pose a most interesting incongruity that, to my knowledge, has not received enough thought. The first is the near absence of evidence for use of Mark as a text of intrinsic interest for exegetical, apologetical, or liturgical purposes by the Christian literati in the 2nd and early 3rd centuries. In marked sharp contrast to their extensive use of Matthew and John and Luke, and in that order. There is most emphatically not a single trace of evidence that there ever was anything like an interpretive community, to use Stanley Fish's term, in which Mark was a privileged text, with the exception perhaps of some Christian mystery association perhaps in Alexandria. In lieu of a long recitation of a survey of the sources here, let me, for convenience, piggyback on the splendid work of Brenda Dean Schiltgen on the reception history of the Gospel of Mark. And I string together her bottom line statements in what she calls Mark's absent presence in the early Christian documentary record. This is Schilke now. The gospel was present in the canon, but essentially absent from attention. It seemed to be without intrinsic merit. The references or allusions to the Gospel of Mark in citations and lectionary cycles in the patristic period point conclusively to the absence of Mark as a major text in the early church. The actual count of the citations shows that if there was a stepchild in the canon, Mark is the one about whom the fathers spoke most infrequently. That's from Schilke. Indeed, it appears that it was only when Mark said something outrageous enough to give the later fathers serious theological heartburn that they paused at his gospel. For example, Mark's inclusion of the Son among those who did not know the arrival of the apocalyptic day, which was considered to be a bit of Arian nonsense, at which the anti-Arian Christian intellectuals would take considerable umbrage. But even here, they seemed willing to ignore the phrase in Mark, preferring instead to apply their philological and hermeneutical ingenuity to treat the polluting phrase in Matthew's Gospel, which, after all, was the flag or the totem of the emerging centrist Christian clan, and thus much more assiduously read than Mark. All in all, St. Augustine's offhand dismissal of Mark as a breviator in the context of proposing his two-source theory of gospel relationships reflects the judgment about Mark in the centuries preceding Augustine. Separately, says Augustine, he has little to record. Whatever ideational, ideological, social, or political work the Gospels were made to perform in the post-first century Christian formation, Mark's narrative, and much more so its originary interest in exile and identity, was not of interest to those who gave Mark a place in the canon. Now, if you follow me this far, maybe the question that I now ask seems obvious. Why then did Mark make it into the canon at all? The answer is found in a second datum concerning Mark in the 2nd century and in the patristic period in general. And the answer has to do with how Mark became a prestige good without intrinsic value. That's not such a difficult concept. We turn material that has no intrinsic value into prestige goods all the time. You know, we use a cloth to make flags, and we use ordinary balsam wood to make baseball bats, and so on. That is what I make of the patristic tradition of insisting that what the author of Mark wrote derived from Peter. And I'm referring to the idea that Mark was Peter's interpreter, first claimed by Papias in the middle third of the 2nd century, and then repeated with some variation in detail by Justin Martyr, by Irenaeus, by Tertullian, Origen, and on into the 3rd and 4th and 5th centuries, becoming a fact by means of repeated recitation, until the onset of modern or post-Enlightenment biblical criticism. In terms of historical authenticity, the claim that Mark was the ghostwriter of what is really Peter's gospel has been discredited by modern scholarship, but that is quite beside the point of my interest. What is of interest is that this claim is made at all, and then repeated so often that it seems to reach the status of taken for granted and undisputed fact. Why? One recurring answer in the scholarly commentary tradition is that the Mark-Peter connection enhances the merit and authority of Mark. It serves, quote, to uphold the integrity and worth of Mark in Hugh Anderson's words. But this integrity and worth suggestion is rendered quite dubious or doubtful by the striking lack of evidence that anyone actually read Mark. A lack, moreover, that is not mitigated by what appears to be such certain knowledge that Mark's gospel is really Peter's gospel. Hence, I would think that the Petrine connection is a bit of a shibboleth that does not add luster to the integrity and worth of Mark, at least not with reference to its intrinsic value. For Mark's Petrine imprimatur appears not to have placed Mark on the must-read list of early Christian associations. I'm now going to amplify this incongruity. It is difficult to explain Petrine authorship of Mark by supposing that the status ascendancy, the rise in status of Peter in the 2nd century and beyond, should be appropriately recognized by a Gospel of Peter, which, though he did not actually write one, nonetheless would be his anagraphe, his record, playing on Clement of Alexandria's term. This would require us to believe that Peter was responsible for a record, or an anagraphe, that on the evidence from Mark's narrative is most anti-Petrine. If you've read the Gospel of Mark, Peter does not come up very well in that Gospel. An anti-Petrinism that is matched only by the anti-Petrinism in Paul's letter to the Galatians and perhaps in the Gospel of John, the first 20 chapters. It is in this connection that I find most amusing a bit of slippage in Clement of Alexandria's credulousness in one of his rehearsals of the Mark is Peter's amanuensis claim. Clement makes this claim, but he phrases it in such a way that makes me think that he was winking at the readers. Clement intimates that Mark's anagraphe may have been a case of an unauthorized memoir. I paraphrase what Clement says. This is a paraphrase. I have the Greek text. You can translate it more elegantly if you wish. This is a paraphrase. When Peter learned of Mark's project of writing out the gospel that Peter had been preaching in Rome, he said, that is, Peter said, I'm not going to stop him, but I sure as hell won't give him any encouragement either. Here we have it exactly. The incongruity on brilliant display. Mark, a prestigious narrative by virtue of its emplacement in the emerging canon. Mark apparently without intrinsic value in the very canon that bestows prestige on it. Hence as really absent even though present. Mark presented as Peter's memoir, but without any consequence for Mark's influence at a time when Peter was becoming increasingly valorized and influential. Mark presented as Peter's memoir, despite the fact that Mark's story features Peter as a dense-headed character who would seem ill-suited to ascend to the status of the holder of the keys of the kingdom of heaven, that is the church, as Matthew's gospel claims for him, and announcing what would become the axiomatic view of centrist Christianity after the first century. And so I suggest that a different tack is needed. It is noteworthy recently to see an appreciative, even rehabilitating reconsideration of the once heretical argument made by F.C. Bauer long ago, that Paul and his theology of a crucified Christ and his view that the law was passé in the new Christus era represented not a widespread, much less central view, but a sectoral and a view, an embattled one. and a rather lonely voice crying in the proverbial wilderness of early Christian social and ideological formations. With respect to Mark, it is just as interesting to observe as the Joel Marcus, a North American scholar, and others have pointed out, a remarkable return to what he calls the question of the relation between Mark and Paul. A question that has been considered as answered, or had been considered as answered, in Martin Werner's 1923 refutation of Gustav Woltmann's 1857 thesis that Mark's gospel is an allegory in which Jesus is really Paul. Now, Werner's refutation argued for no cross-contamination, and there's a pun in English here, at all. In fact, there are a good number of striking similarities between Paul and Mark, as Marcus demonstrates. For example, now quoting Marcus, not everyone agreed that Paul and the law was passé for Christians, but Mark did. And he even expressed his point in terms that are remarkably similar to those of Paul in Rome, Romans 14. Not everyone was as negative as Paul about Peter and Jesus' family, but Mark was. And only Mark among the New Testament writers gives to one of his stories, that of the Syro-Phoenician woman, an interpretation that echoes Paul's formula to the Jew first, then to the Gentiles. If these are coincidences, they are amazing ones. And if not, and I think not, says Marcus, they provide evidence of Pauline influence on Mark. I think Marcus is correct about the evidence. And on the preponderance of this evidence, New Testament Mark clearly is not a Petrine, but a Pauline anagraphe. When and how this influence took place is difficult to pinpoint, and it doesn't really, for the purposes of this talk here today, matter that much. What is remarkable is that the patently Pauline echoes in Mark did not positively purchase Mark's ticket of admission into the canon. More precisely, insofar as Mark was amenable to being read in a Pauline key, it could gain admission to the canon only by masking Mark's Paulinism and giving it a Petrine as imprimatur, as unlikely as that is. If this is so, why not try another move and seriously consider the possibility that Mark should be placed on the same side of what Joseph Tyson, in his consequential recent book on Marcion and Luke Acts, calls the defining struggle over marking the Christian center in the second century. The same side, this is the side marked by a totem pole, use a Canadian metaphor, on which are carved the faces of Marcion and his intellectual hero, Paul, and, I'm suggesting, Mark. That Mark was considered to be on the wrong side, apparently, was at least presumed, if not a known fact in the late second century. If an early dating of the anti-Marcionite prologue to Mark can be sustained. There's an argument about dating of the anti-Marcionite prologue. In this sense, Mark represents a confiscation, just as the Pauline corpus is in the New Testament as a good package of goods, confiscated for a post-first century myth of Christian origins, in which Paul is not the flag of the Marcionite clan, but thoroughly subordinated to the Peter-led, single and unified Christian church, as we see it represented in the Acts of the Apostles, the Apostelgeschichte, and elsewhere. In this struggle over defining a Christian myth of origins that could work as a foundation myth and epic for the project of creating a single Christian entity, for marking its Orthodox center, in part by combating the threat of different voices as peripheral or entirely beyond the pale. It was important to claim texts that the second century mythmakers really wanted. Apparently, it was just as important to claim texts that they did not really want, because they wanted even less for the so-called opponents to have them. I now return to Marshall Sahlins' story about Mrs. Dowsett and Mr. Charlton. At the structural level, what happened to Mark after the first century strikes me as analogous to Sahlins' story. Like Mrs. Dowsett, who was worried about some guy's wall encroaching on her property, very local, very quotidian concern, so originary Mark's worry appears to have been over rather local problems concerning home and identity. Like Mr. Charlton's amplification of Mrs. Dowsett's micro-problem and intercalation of it into higher-level conflicts involving international empire and colonies, Mark's originary local problems in all their urgency and his response to them with a near panic were transposed into, confiscated for, a struggle over defining later Christian centers and margins. A struggle that coincided with the move in late antiquity to shift authority and prestige from secret knowledge that has inspired speech to sacred books. Okay, that's sort of the story about Mark. I conclude with just a few comments of a methodological and conceptual kind. For reasons partly due to Mark's eventual achievement of first gospel status in post-Enlightenment gospel criticism, and partly due to the conflation of this source-critical fact with the theological value placed on first times, we have, I think, overstressed our expectation of Mark as a key witness for what Christian things happened in the first century. Mark is in motion across time, place, and social setting, and the shifting, contingent, and local realities through which Mark passed are not best thought of in terms of continuities and trajectories. Terms that obscure precisely those contingencies of greatest interest to us about Mark's historical work, or his work in history. And so, perhaps counterintuitively, for a historiographical stance that may help us, I suggest that in terms of the history of Christianity, the second century precedes the first. Later centuries too, for that matter. Let's see how we can make sense of the same evidence if we take the post-first centuries, not the first century, as the grand era of Christian myth-making, which includes the creation of the first century as a Christian one. Let me elaborate with an assist of an articulation again made by my Canadian colleague, William Arnell. What evidence, he suggests, that is available to us strongly tells us that not merely the terminology, but probably also the conception of Christianity, of the term, are products of the second century. As is well known, only 3 occurrences of the adjective Christian appear in the New Testament, and they occur in documents that should be dated into the second century. 1 Peter and the Acts of the Apostles. The term does not appear at all in any of the canonical Gospels, or the Gospel of Thomas for that matter, nor in the letters of Paul. In the case of the Acts of the Apostles, the use of the term is retrojected back into the first century, but the document itself, that is the Acts, comes from the beginning or middle of the second century, and thus indicates only what was claimed about the first century by writers of the second. Ignatius, sometime in the early to middle 2nd century, that is in the same range, represented by 1 Peter and Acts, and by contrast to most of the New Testament writings, uses Christian, the term Christian, frequently and freely. The abstract noun Christianity, that is Christianismos, is very rare, but is also more significant. Its first known use, and perhaps its invention, is to be traced to Ignatius, who uses it 4 times. It is quite an important term, and implies much more than the adjective Christian. Its form, Christianismos, and its juxtaposition with an implicitly analogous Judaismus transforms a term that designates ancestral or patronal affiliation into an ideological system and an overarching way of life. This innovation in terminology is accompanied by behavioral reinforcements in Ignatius. So Ignatius is asserting and thereby helping to generate in his letters and his visits a unity with various scattered individuals and especially groups in Asia Minor. The act of mutual recognition of a common identity actually creates the distinct shared identity, which Ignatius defines as Christianism, thus enacting such an identity in both word and deed. While apparently lacking the terminology of Christianity, the author of Luke Acts does something similar on a narrative scale. He constructs a tale, and this will sound familiar to those of you who have been in the Bloch seminar. He constructs a tale in which a huge variety of individuals and events are fused together in a common story, a synthesis that asserts the social and ideological unity of these persons and events, their shared identity. If this is correct, that is not to say, of course, that nothing happened in the 1st century. But it is to say few Christian things happened. That is Christian now in the sense of Ignatius' term Christianismos. And that whatever happened in the 1st century is massively mediated to us by what happened in the 2nd century and later. And this includes the all-important determination of the facts that are given the weight of evidentiary data for the 1st century in 2nd century Christian myth-making. Linkages, trajectories, successions, traditions, and the like go not forward in time, but backward. They are categories made for manufacturing origins in the full mythic sense of that term. They are categories that are employed in a retrospective mode and in a mood for first times. I would suggest that these terms, to which one might add others, such as canon making, legacy making, even the current fondness for the making and transmission of cultural memory. I don't know if cultural memory is a critical category and that fascinates scholars here, but it's all the rage, especially by a few colleagues of mine at my own university. These are terms that might become subject to what Jonathan Z. Smith has called the rectification of categories, because their cognitive gain and analytic payoffs is rather doubtful. The incongruous burden placed on the Gospel of Mark, on the one hand, he has nothing to report. On the other, it is a grade A witness to what Christian things happened in the 1st century, seems to invite, if not require, such activity of rectification on the parts of students of the formation of early Christianity. This would mean, I think, giving up an excessive preoccupation with a recovery of first times or origins, as an operational credo in the history of religions scholarship. Much more interesting and more accessible to the historian are the creations of first times, of origins, by communities who identify themselves with reference to that origin. The result of such activity, I would suggest, not only would demythologize the early Christian myth of origins, but also, and probably more importantly, demythologize the scholarly historiography of early Christian myth-making. Thank you.
Ja, vielen Dank.
Ja.
Bei diesem doch durchaus provokativen Vortrag wird es vielleicht einige Fragen geben.
Bitte.
I think it's just an unimportant question, but you mentioned Mark as a breviator, and I must confess I'm not able to think, I don't know what a breviator means.
Oh, I'm so sorry. That is a Latin term that means an abbreviator, somebody who takes a long text and shortens it. This comes from the observation that the gospel from, I was quoting St. Augustine in the 4th century, and it comes from his observation, and you know, we can make the same observation, that the Gospel of Mark is much shorter than the Gospels of Matthew and Luke that are on each side of them. So Augustine thought that Mark by itself had nothing new to report. It was simply an abbreviation of the stories we find in Matthew and in Luke.
I didn't understand your proof in connection with the fact that Matthew and Luke use Mark.
Yeah.
This is something which you would agree with.
Yes.
What kind of Mark did Matthew and Luke use, and when happened this use of Mark?
Sie können es auch in Deutsch sagen, wenn Sie wollen.
Ja. Wann geschah das, dass
Ja.
Matthäus und Lukas Markus benutzten? Das bedeutet doch, wenn sie Markus benutzten, dass Markus eine Bedeutung hatte.
Yes.
Oder würden Sie die These, dass die beiden, also welche Form von Markus Sie beide benutzen, wie würden Sie diese Form beschreiben?
Yes, I think the first is just the basic question. It has to do with the synoptic problem and the solution to it. I do belong to that, I think the majority of scholars who subscribe to the two-source theory, that Mark was a gospel that both Matthew and Luke used as a Vorlage. When that happened, well, we don't know. Certainly, most generally it happened after Mark was written. When 70s, 80s, 90s, it's okay, it doesn't really matter to me. I think the point I wanted to draw from that was that in the use of Mark by these other two writers, the aims of the writer of the Gospel of Mark were largely erased. That is, you no longer recognize the voice of Mark if you read Matthew and if you read Luke. They take from Mark the general literary structure and much of the material in the text, but reorder that and submerge all of that beneath their own sort of ideological or theological voices. So in that sense, whatever Mark tried to say has been rendered stumm, mute. Stumm, a German word? Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, but the fact,
That's not your question, is it?
but the fact that they used Mark
Yes.
means that Mark has an importance for them.
Yes.
Because John or other writers didn't use Mark.
Mm.
It was necessary to go back to Mark. The fact that Matthew and Luke use Mark means Mark has an importance for them.
Yes. I agree with that, but I would not want to overstress the importance Mark had for them. Had he been given true authority and true importance, why rewrite him? So I'm not denying that he had that he was of interest, that Mark's text was of interest to later Gospels, but what they were not interested in was in whatever the urgencies, the crises that Mark tried to address in his narrative. That gets lost. So what is taken up is by these early two gospel writers is, in general, the literary structure of a bios of Jesus, which they amplify. Some of the goodies in the text itself, the sayings and the stories and so on, but subordinate that entirely to their own agenda, their literary ideological agenda. So he's important, but not so important that you can't use him and then tell him to leave the room. That I think is what I was trying to say. Now I don't mean to suggest by that Mark's gospel was not unimportant. He was Mark was important in second century Alexandria. I left out, or I did not deal in my paper with another chapter, and that has really to do with the next time after Luke and Matthew make use of Mark, the next time we see Mark pop his head, out of the historical sand, is in second century Alexandria, where he appears to have been read by some people that were especially interested in the secrecy.
Pegasus mentioned. Pegasus is 125.
Yeah.
It is relatively early in the second century. Used Mark among. I think he didn't know Luke. He didn't know John, but he knew Luke and Mark and Matthew, and he used Mark and estimated Mark.
He did.
Estimated Mark. But John Pegasus was somebody who was not so he was able to say, I use the oral tradition
Yes.
even more than the written tradition. But among the written tradition, I like Mark, and I would put Mark in the front of all the others. That is my thesis.
Well, that's fine.
That was 125. That was at the beginning of the second century. So, there's a clear...
But Papias does not actually use Mark. He gives you an account. He gives you an explanation of how this gospel came to be written.
But, yeah, of course.
Yeah, and he claims that it was really Peter's gospel, and Mark was the secretary who took all the bits of sermons that he'd recorded in his parchment or in his head, and wrote it down, right? And it's that interesting. That was part of my paper. It's that interesting observation that Mark is Peter's gospel, even though it is so unlikely. When you read Mark's gospel, Peter is by no means a figure who's idolized and complimented in that gospel.
What happened with Matthew and John
Yeah.
and the others? Each gospel was related back to one of the
Yeah.
disciples.
Yeah.
That's the
Right.
normal way in which the second century was working.
No.
This is nothing special to Mark.
No. No, that alone is not special. You're quite right. But that the attribution was made to Peter, that to me strikes me as so unlikely that it was done for very strategic political purposes rather than on the basis of the text valorization or idealization of the figure of Peter. Mark's theology is much closer to Paul than to Peter. Insofar as we know anything about Peter.
I think you showed very convincingly to what extent it was used in terms of mythologization and so forth. But still, there's a problem for me in your title. Because what text should it be, if not a Christian text? Because it's not a Jewish text.
It's not? Well, it was.
No, yes, but if it's a Jewish text, it nevertheless focuses on Jesus.
Yes.
And in that sense, I think this is the beginning of something that we later on call Christian text.
Well, it's the later on.
That's-
The later on that's crucial.
I would like to know what the title exactly means if you take off all that following tradition and say what kind of text is it in itself?
I try to speak to that in the very first part of the paper, in which I suggested that Mark is a narrative meditation on problems of identity, Jewish identity, homeland, exile, in the trauma of the Jewish war, around 70 and so on, and that it finds in the person of Jesus a sympathetic, or at least the way the character of Jesus is represented in the gospel, an analogous or an exemplary character who embodies the very sorts of traumas and difficulties that Mark himself or the author seems to feel. That is sort of doubly exiled. Yeah.
Let me put it the other way around.
Yeah. All right.
Do you think that he didn't believe in Jesus as a prophet or a messiah, something? In any case, it's not a neutral text. It's not the text of identity completely cut off the later importance of Jesus. I agree with you, but in fact, Christianity starts with believing in Jesus as a leading figure for something, and the interpretation comes later on. But in any case, it's something that makes a difference with regard to all the Jews who didn't believe in him, or who didn't take Jesus very seriously, or didn't see him as an important figure in their own life and things like that. My feeling is still that he is concentrating on Jesus, and in that sense, I would say it's, of course, in the beginning, but somehow a Christian text.
Yeah. I might have been a little too subtle or unclear. I was attempting to argue that the term Christian or Christianismos as both a theological term, but much more as a term of social identification that would embrace a large variety, ideological, theological, geographical variety of groups that were excited about Jesus or Christ in some way, but thought of him in very different ways. That Ignatius and then people following him saw that diversity as a problem, and tried to forge a kind of an overarching unity, at least in thought, and by means of story and by means of the invention of these abstractions, such as Christianismos. Now, so in that sense, neither Paul nor Mark is Christian. I mean, Mark was attracted to the Jesus figure to think about how to deal with his own doubly exiled sort of trauma in relation to homeland. So that interest that Mark had in Jesus is not taken up. What is taken up is the cross theology in Mark that became central later on. What interests me most is that even though he mediates that, he supports that kind of cross theology, much more so than Matthew does and Luke does. Why is it that he is uniformly ignored in the second century? So it seems to me that Mark was there as a kind of a placeholder in the palace that was being constructed by a circle of influential Christian elites in the second century that would be responsible for this invention of Christianismos. And Mark is taken up for that purpose. And that's when Mark really begins to do Christian duties.
If I may make a parallel, it's a little bit that kind of argument that we find in the Roman Catholic Church.
That hurts.
As the first pope, without knowing that he was ever any pope.
Yeah.
So in a certain sense, it's a retrospective interpretation.
Yeah.
That matters, but nevertheless, my point was that I think he is still somehow distinct from his Jewish fellows of his time. And there is a group that believes in Jesus, in what kind ever. But anyway, they are distinct from all the Jews who don't.
If one draws the line, if one makes the classification in that way, you're correct. If one classifies late post-temple Judaism, first and second century Judaism, as those who believed in Christ and those who didn't, I don't like that classification very much, because what that classification does, it homogenizes, it flattens those who didn't, and it is and the differences there are just as important. And if one observes the many forms of I hate to use the plural, but Judaisms of that period, then it is not.
My argument would be different. I would say.
Yeah. I know.
It's a minority that did, and the majority did.
That's right.
So I emphasize the majority, not the minority. I would be misunderstood if I interpreted the majority from the minority perspective.
Yes.
Of course, in the later history, you are right. But in the beginning, it's Judaism at his time, and then there is a special group, like in Israel today, where you find Jews, strange group, Jews who believe in Jesus as the Messiah, but consider themselves as being Jews and not Christians.
Yeah, that is an oxymoron in the modern world, but it wasn't in the middle of the first century.
Yes, but if you go to the first century, then you find these Jews who took him as some important person. I wouldn't say that all saw in him a Messiah, but nevertheless, they had a special relationship to him and to his teachings, perhaps also to his deeds, I don't know. But anyway, they saw themselves as a special group which had not yet Christology
Yeah.
in dogmatic terms. This came later on with different.
Precisely, and I think that was my
But,
point.
but in the beginning, I would still say Mark is a Christian text in that sense, in that narrow or broad, I don't know how we would call it. In that sense, it's a Christian text, not in terms of Christianity that was established.
All right. It may be that that title has been a bit misdirective. It is meant to be provocative. What if I were to agree with you about Mark being a first century Christian text? It seems to me, and I'm prepared to, but it seems that the argument I was trying to make actually is not affected by that. Whatever it was that originary Mark was excited about is not what gave him a place in the canon. So we can argue about was it a Christian or not Christian. For me, that term isn't properly used by first century writers who are excited about Jesus or Christ. So I don't want us to misunderstand each other. I think the primary argument wasn't really about that, about whether Mark was a Christian or not, but it had to do with the takeover of Mark in later periods for purposes that were very, very different and even ignorant of the purposes that the originary writer had. And those purposes seem to be not so much theological. The second century Christians didn't really need Mark for the cross gospel. In fact, they were as worried about some of the things in Mark, especially his notion of the kingdom of God as a secret that only the insiders know, and we don't want to tell the outsiders because if they get in on the secret, that's not very good. That was problematic for them. It was precisely that which appealed to readers of Mark that were perhaps of the Marcionite persuasion, that also avidly read Paul as the purveyor of this mysterious wisdom. So neither originary Mark or the interests of Mark's most avid second century readers was the ticket for Mark's admission into the canon. It seemed precisely for other purposes, to combat precisely that. I think that was my argument. So Mark, that helps me make sense of why Mark is there, but never read. The next time, after the second century, or after when Mark appears, is in the Middle Ages, when Bede or Bede writes a commentary. I think the only commentary on Mark written. There were none written in the early period. There were scores of them written on the other Gospels. And then Mark again goes into total obscurity, and he surfaces again when? In the 18th and 19th century, when this text now becomes very, very important in the source critical studies, and he receives the place as the first narrative gospel. And again, that was for very interesting reasons that have really nothing to do with the intrinsic merits or demerits of the text itself.
I don't want to interrupt your discussion.
No.
I don't know if I help you with that, but I think we must remember that the text needs people who call it a Christian text or romantic text or blah blah blah.
Absolutely.
And it's important to remember that the idea is necessary, the idea of Christentum. And if I understood you
Yeah.
right, you try
Yes. Not so much called it Christian text. I know of no second century text or Christian text that ever is at all raises the question, is Mark a Christian text or not? In my argument, the fact that it was sort of confiscated from certain readers suggests to me that that centrist circle of Christian theologians and literati of the late 2nd century and early 3rd century, who historically, in retrospect, kind of were the shapers of centrist Christianity, really weren't that interested in Mark, but they brought it into the canon as a way of domesticating it and subordinating it to the overarching gospel or theology of orthodoxy. I just wanted to say whether that answered your question.
It wasn't a question.
It was a helpful comment. It was.
For me, the title was very interesting.
Ah.
Of course, good for this.
Thank you.
May I just add
Peter.
another point, because there's one striking phenomenon also in that sense that this confiscation, as you call it, was total. Because there was a debate about which gospel can be integrated into the canon afterwards and not. But as far as I know, Mark's belonging to this canon was never contested.
No.
There was no group inside the group of Christians that ever had the suspicion that this text wouldn't belong to the canonic text. And this is very different from the situation with other Gospels, which later on were called apocryphal.
Yeah, although there too, I don't think there was much discussion about them. At least I don't know of any prolonged or specific discussions that discussed the merits of a gospel and then after discussing it said, nah, not this one. We don't have that kind of discussion either.
But this is also a strange
Yeah.
phenomenon or an argument in favor of its Christian text. So to speak.
It certainly is a Christian text
Yeah.
once it is in the canon.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes. I think we're not disagreeing with each other. I think we're slightly rubbing each other, but we're not butting up.
We have different emphasis.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay.
With regard to this early history.
Because I would not want to butt heads with you. That would be dangerous for me.
No.
Yeah.
I think you are right in saying the construction of the building of the canon was a domesticating process. That's clear. But all the other questions are still open. The importance of Mark during the 2nd century is higher than you can prove. And when there was the gospel to the Hebrews, the gospel to the Nazarenes, the gospel.
Oh, there were 32 or more of them. Yes.
And they were. Everybody said no, but nobody said during the 2nd century we don't like Mark. Never. Even there's not one voice.
That
There are many voices against the Hebrew Christian Gospels and against the Gnostic Gospels.
Yeah.
I mean, this is obvious, but there is no voice against Mark.
No.
As far as we know. Those texts, perhaps if they have ever existed, were not reported. Yes, we don't know. But we know a lot of debates in the canonization process about all the other texts that were excluded. But about Mark, there was no discussion. I think there was a discussion about John, but not about Mark. All these synoptic.
The discussion about John, as far as I know, was never about whether John should be in the canon or not.
That's right.
It had to do with the difference of John between a difference of John and the other three Gospels. So Irenaeus comes along and solves the problem by saying, well, you know, the first three, they tell us what happened. John tells us what it meant. Yeah. But there was no discussion. But I think we're getting here just a little bogged down in some of the surely arguable and debatable minor points in the argument. I think I would not want us to, well, my main argument really had to do with a kind of a historiography of the history of religions, where we ought to be cautious in taking the imagined histories of a Christian community's own origins as a history, but see it rather as a myth-making process, and then to examine the processes of that myth-making, including, you know, the exercise of power relations and ideologies and the conditions, so on. So that was, I think, my point. And I thought I could use Mark as an example to demonstrate that the first century as the period of pristine, fully disclosed origins that included within it all of the so-called DNA that would then program the evolution and development of Christianity, you know, as a straight line that ends up in Rome. That I think is a Christian myth, and Mark is a placeholder in that myth making. I think that was the point, and I think that is a more general theoretical point. It's not that controversial. It is a bit controversial when it is applied to Christianity, and from your comments, I can again understand why, because I think it was someone with whom that's very contrary to what we've learned and what we know. So again, for strategic purposes, Antes, it helps me to say that Mark was not a Christian text in the first century. I will, after we've had a beer together, I will agree with you, but for strategic purposes of argumentation.
No problem about that.
Yeah, I also think that maybe your counterpoint is kind of going to different conceptions. Maybe the Christian text in the title of this lecture refers to the kind of Christian text as a theological category opposed to what you maybe want to see as a kind of differentiation of the early Christianities or movements were referring to Jesus as a person, as a kind of analytical category in the history of religion, so to speak.
Yeah.
And that's, I would think it doesn't, it's no problem to have a work with each other, especially if you say that it's kind of strategical effect that you say it became a Christian text in the way that it became in a theological category, kind of way where it is a kind of unifying identity marker for everyone, and especially linked with this kind of linear history of the origins of Christianity. But in fact, I would also say it's absolutely necessary to work on distinguishing, make differentiations. If you study especially early Christianities, what actually are you working on, or whether it's now
Yeah.
kind of Christian group in this sense or not, or,
Yeah.
or
Yeah.
Judaism.
Yeah.
And so I think it's not.
I think that's a very helpful clarification, Martin. Thank you.
problematic,
Yeah.
because it's on different layers.
Yeah.
So to speak, yeah.
Yes. It's important to distinguish those, very much so.
Just my 2 cents.
Nochmal ganz vielen Dank für den Vortrag, für die
Also,
Präsentation.